Welcome. I'm your host, Mark Graziano, and this is the GRC Podcast. This is your source for discussions about governance, risk, compliance, and more. I partner with incredible security champions to challenge the GRC industry stereotype and to outline security career and program strategies that you can implement today. Joining me today is someone I consider to be a once-in-a-lifetime security leader, Stephen Nguyen, Business Information Security Officer of Data and Applications at Twilio. I stumbled upon Steve and his approach to GRC and security a few years ago when I was reading an industry blog. In that article, they described his style as pioneering a new way of thinking about GRC, and after working for him in both his roles as former director of GRC at Segment and now in his current role as BISO at Twilio, I can absolutely confirm that they couldn't have been more accurate. GRC has unfortunately gained a reputation that's practitioners focus more on work volume rather than work value. More tickets, more reports, more meetings. Working for Steve, this was never the case. Everything asked of GRC could clearly and explicitly be tied back to business betterments, whether that be increases in ARR, increases in efficiency, or tangible, quantifiable decreases in risk. As far as GRC programs go, Steve was running a GRC laboratory, not curating a GRC museum. This characterization is important. As businesses become increasingly automated and fast-paced, a GRC team's adaptability plays a key role in the business's ability to stay agile and competitive, and this is especially true when it comes to vendor risk management and security sales enablement. In many companies, it's typical to see these functions separated, but Steve's GRC team had a unique perspective of sitting on both sides of the procurement table, which led to some pragmatic program decisions that struck a balance between maintaining operational agility and ensuring reasonable security assurance. I'm thrilled for Steve to share some of his insights that you can implement immediately, and I'm hopeful that the wider industry will start to adopt his do unto others approach to vendor risk management, paving a way for a better user experience and stronger security assurance for everyone involved in the process. Let's get into it. Steve, welcome to the GRC podcast. This is really fun for me. For listeners who don't know, I actually found Steven's segment based on a blog post that he did, and it was an interview. So it's really fun for me to be able to do the same for you and interview you personally.
I appreciate it, Mark. Thanks for having me as a guest, and yeah, it was pretty cool that we were able to indirectly recruit you at the time by doing a GRC blog, and I think it was about a year later that you actually joined the team. So I guess
Yep.
that
Actually, in
was
my show notes, I have a screenshot of the message that I sent you. I was like, "Hey, man, I like the way you think," and that was a
yeah.
year before I actually joined the company.
Yeah, and I guess a fact on my side is I had no idea we had been connected on LinkedIn that long, because typically a lot of the connections is like, hey, when you start working with someone. I did not realize I had been connected to you a year or almost a year prior to you joining our team. So that was very, very cool, but very excited to be on your podcast, Mark.
And then using the blog as kind of an additional segue. So we had Dustin on for episode 1, and between the two blogs that I'm familiar with you all writing, one was moving left, moving forward in GRC, and that was basically a talk about making sure that you're considering GRC within the sales process earlier on than later. And then Dustin, who was in episode 1, actually had, "Are you wasting your time with third-party risk?" So in episode 1, Dustin left us with the idea that you need to be able to relate your work to the business in some way, shape, or form. And I think vendor risk management and the sales process is one of those kind of less complicated ways to explain to people who aren't familiar with GRC how these particular processes are moving the business forward. But at the same time, you are well aware, again, based on your blog, the issues that arise when it comes to security compliance for vendor risk management and for the sales process. Obviously, there's a lot of NDAs, questionnaires, document requests, customer calls. So everything is really complex, whether you're on the procuring side or you're on the selling side. So I was curious about what your initial thoughts were just for those two processes, for selling and for procuring. What are the major issues that you're currently seeing? Because we had a conversation recently too, where this is something that came to mind. So I'm kind of curious as to why vendor risk management and the sales process is kind of top of mind for you recently.
Yeah, so I think I think there are times when we talk about whether we call it sales enablement or customer trust, security enablement. We talk about that somewhat in a bit of a silo with third party risk or or vendor risk, right? They could be different functions, but really, when I was managing a GRC team, Mark. We own both sides of that coin, right? It was, what questions are we asking our potential vendors, and conversely, what are prospective customers asking us? And I think having the view of both sides, I think, is a pretty valuable lens to be able to evaluate your own program. So for example, the questions that we got to see as part of trying to grow to enterprise scale at Segment, right, introduced us to security questions and questionnaires, and uh, in certain cases audits of questions that we thought were, quite frankly, pretty profound, right? I think Dustin brought up an example in 2019 of the pandemic question, right? That's obviously a very specific scenario of a question that we were like, okay, what's the likelihood of this? And we have no idea how to measure the impacts of that. And obviously we know how that one played out, but it really allowed us insight to looking at the questions that we were asking our own vendors, right, or our own prospective vendors. So as we started reconciling, back and forth, I think one of the observations we had, Mark, was there were gaps within kind of how we were assessing our own third parties, and we certainly needed to, you know I wouldn't say revolutionize, but I think we had to have a real hard reckoning on what we were doing, how we were spending our time. I think another aspect of it is, how we were we spending the supplier's time, or I should say the vendor's time, right? Knowing that they're not going to dedicate 4 hours and providing you every detailed response in the world, is like, how can we evaluate this vendor in X amount of time, and get some level of assurances that, hey, they're going to protect our data.
Now, in terms of, I think the resource constraints is one of the big things. And then when you mentioned seeing some issues, was there anything like right away that you noticed at Segment? Because I think, again, if you want to tell the story of how you became the GRC director over at Segment, how you were almost a team of one, getting handed that entire company and having all those different practices that had already been spun up to a certain degree, you having fresh eyes on it. Was there anything for vendor risk specifically that you were seeing, like, hey, like we need to change, or as somebody who's just a team of one, this is not going to work?
Yeah, I think there's one pretty obvious answer to that, Mark, and it was really the manual efforts to send out questionnaires. When you're sending out a manual spreadsheet, you have to do things like version control, right? And those things are just absolutely time wasters. They're absolutely time killers. So, I joined Segment in 2019. There was a small GRC team, and as I think 2 or 3 weeks prior to me joining, essentially both of those folks got opportunities elsewhere. And when I joined in June, there was no GRC team outside of myself. And to me, this was an area, having taken over the third party risk piece for Segment, that there, quite frankly, I just could not spend time on. We had audits, we had opportunities we were working with customers on. Again, going back to the whole enterprise readiness conversation for Segment at the time. And, we were spending time asking a vendor, oh, who had our questionnaire? Was it complete? Right. And could you send us back a version? And at the same time, we had an internal GRC tool, and just playing around with this tool, Mark, or I was able to identify, hey, this is something that we could probably spend 2 days importing our existing questions in, and it had this very, very simple interface to email questionnaires out to our vendors. And there, it removed this workflow of having to chase people down. It would, at the time I was like, oh, this is a really cool feature. It would email me when somebody hit submit, right? Or it would send them a reminder after a certain cadence if nothing had been completed. And I was like, wow, like, this is something, when you're a GRC team of one at the time, is a pretty valuable tool, a pretty valuable um, workflow for you to be able to, quite frankly, focus on other things. And for me, focusing on other things in terms of third party risk was really being able to understand the context of which, this particular vendor that, we were trying to use, what type of data were they having access to? Where are they integrating? All right. What's their hosting? What's their hosting model? And really allowed me to really, again, save a little bit of time on what I'll call the administrative pieces, and focus a little bit more on the kind of the tactical and the operational piece of what, really why was somebody in the business looking to use this vendor.
That's yeah, that's why I really like talking to people like you and Dustin, because obviously there's still a mindset shift that I need to have when it comes to looking at GRC, because I feel like a lot of people are probably similar to the way of my thinking is when I posed that question, I was thinking you're going to say something like I don't know, like the number of questions that we were going to ask or the types of risks that we were concerned about, and it was going to be a very GRC specific answer to that question as opposed to hey, just we need to make this faster and this is a business process thing, and then we can start tackling some of the other GRC maturity aspects.
Absolutely, and to give you context and to kind of replay history a little bit, when we started building out the automated questionnaire in this particular tool, Mark, we actually built out a few different versions of it, right? And it's one of those scenarios where you invest once and you can get a lot of mileage out of these questionnaires. We had one that was cloud specific. We had one that was professional services. We had one that was security and privacy. We had a very short intake, right? To really, at least I think it was 6 or 7 questions that we had worked with procurement on to allow us to understand, which security questionnaire, which automated security questionnaire we should be sending them. So there definitely is a level of understanding that we needed to obtain even prior, right, to sending out any questionnaire for us to be able to, really evaluate this prospective vendor, right, in a real, a lot of times finite amount of time. And then just kind of the flip side of that too, if you're, if we want to talk about the customer piece, Mark, you and I are still supporting at least some of the customer, enablement areas for segment. And I think we still see it. And I think one of the most surprising aspects of this is, there are very, very recognizable companies and brands that we work with, right? That are still sending us this like monolithic 300 question spreadsheet, right? Or, a Word doc, right? And, they're asking us to copy and paste screenshots and fill in text
And email
in
it
a,
back to us.
yeah, let's email it back to us. Um, and, it makes you wonder. And a lot of these questions in terms of the scoping, right? You could tell there was either a misunderstanding of what it is, the services that we are providing, or there's a one size fits all, one net to catch all vendor or prospective third parties that this company is working with, all their security risks and vulnerabilities, and this and that. So I think, again, I bring that example up to say it definitely is a driver for us, or was a driver for us when I was leading that area, to really evaluate how our program was operating, because I did not want us to be one of those functions, Mark, where we're sending for the sake of sending, right? And we're sending just to be able to tell our procurement partners and legal partners that we did a security review. If we came back and just be like, "Yep, good," then yeah, I mean, we could have picked literally the path of least resistance and just get it over with. But obviously, that is not the intent of a of a third party, or if you want to call it vendor, slightly different risk management program for an organization.
Now, from a business structure perspective, so obviously, because of the team size, you and Dustin were doing both of these things, but it is traditional to have some type of customer enablement function and some type of vendor risk function that do their jobs separately. There's not much interaction. Do you think there was a benefit to you guys seeing both sides of the coin, where you had to deal with the intake of customer questionnaires and customer questions, the amount of time that put on you guys, as well as the things that you were expecting from your vendors?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if this is a provocative take here, Mark, but I think GRC functions should really be built to be cross functional. And what I mean by that is, even if you scale to a much larger size, right? I don't think it's a great I don't think it's great to have folks just focus on one aspect of the G, the R, or the C, right? Because in really a high functioning program, the G, the R, and the C should all be working together. They understand what the objectives are. They understand, what are the constraints of each of those areas. And I think in the example that you asked, right? Yes, we were a very small team and we were kind of forced at hand, right? We could not have a person just to do compliance and a person just to write policies and a person just to evaluate risk. But when you're seeing all those three areas, right, and the impacts of all three areas, you are able to identify like where kind of the gaps are, right? What's not working well, right? And I don't think there is a honestly a better example of, having to answer security questionnaires and also assess vendors, right? You really see it on both sides. And I think, as folks think about this from a, leadership standpoint, right? And if you're managing a small and medium-sized team, a GRC team, the other direct benefit of this is you create redundancy within the skill sets, right? Of, hey, you have one or two people who manage a program and only those folks manage this program. What happened if they leave? What happened if they apply for another opportunity? What happens to that particular part of the function? And I think for GRC practitioners too, right? I think it's a benefit too. Like unless you are very very passionate about like compliance, right? You want to be the ISO FedRAMP high trust person, right? That's all power to you. But I think as an IC, I would want to work on multiple things at the same time, right? That's another feather in my GRC cap. So going back to answer your question, Mark, I absolutely think there is a lot of value and power in having folks do things cross functionally within the GRC program. And I do think it did directly influence how we wanted to mature our third party risk function.
Now, in terms of picking the relevant activities that you're doing, is one of the things that I know you've kind of instilled in me is if you're going to be spending additional amount of time, let's take say you created a process that now takes 10 times the amount of time or 10 times the amount of resources to complete. Does that create 10 times the level of risk reduction to your business? What are some of the things that you've keyed in on? This is what we're going to assess. This is what we feel good about in terms of the time that it takes to assess it. Like this feels appropriate. What are some of the, I guess, the key things that you brought into your own vendor risk program?
That, that's a really good question, and I think you really feel that, right, Mark, when you're on the end of having to address 500-600 questions on a questionnaire, right? And I know you've been on that side of the equation as well, and I
Excel
think you,
spreadsheet tab number 70. Yeah, you kind of start losing
yeah,
steam at that point.
yeah, when you're scrolling right on a spreadsheet, you're on like column BB or BK or whatever it may be. It's been a pretty heavy one. But this has just been my philosophy when it comes to third party risk. And again, I don't know if this is folks will disagree, but I think there's two things. I definitely think there are diminishing returns. I think asking 1,000 questions or 200 questions does not make your responses better than a 50 question questionnaire, right? The quality of questions matter a lot. So, for example, I'll pick on a tactical example, right? Almost every security questionnaire will ask something to the effect, do you have a breach notification process? Right? A lot of times, yes, no. Fill in, free text field, right? The question really is about not do you have a process, right? If I'm really hoping you have a process, right? If we're evaluating you, it's really how quickly can you notify us, right? Or maybe the question is how, what type of test do you do to evaluate the maturity of your process? So, in the example of the questionnaires we built, Mark, the questions for us, and again, this is not about, you can assess a vendor in 25 questions, right? Or 40 or 10. The gist of this is really you need to ask questions of the vendor that actually make them think a little bit, right? And in our case, we were asking questions around maturity of different areas. Do you still support, what flavors of TLS do you support, right? If you're to some type of solution where we are supporting, sending data over, public internet, or things around encryption settings and things around, do you enforce, we did not ask questions around, oh, do you enforce passwords, right? We had a question around the complexity of passwords. Did you align to, NIST, da da da, or did you just have, what were your requirements? So it was almost from a perspective we were asking questions that we assumed you had these controls in place. There was definitely a radio button that allowed you to say you didn't, but really we were trying to challenge you a little bit in saying, hey, Like, okay, we assume you have this in place. You tell us what you think your maturity is. And I think when we had done this, I think there was a kind of a indirect benefit of this, Mark, is we started realizing, and this was even with some very early stage companies. We were at the time evaluating companies that were like, Series A, and some of them were like literally stealth, they didn't even have a name. And we would send them this questionnaire, and the CEO, right, would be responding. And they would come back with almost like a pure near perfect score, right? And perfect score and the tool that we use, you can weigh the questions and weigh the responses, and it gives you this, kind of initial, I'll call it initial risk triage, right? Which is helpful, right? Doesn't mean you don't go in and evaluate further, but it gives you a insight. But we would go in and see, oh, okay, you have every control in place. You're a brand new company, but essentially you're enforcing zero trust.
No
You're going to
security
notify us.
resources. You're just crushing it in the security realm.
Yeah, you're crushing it. But then, like, one of our questions, and I can talk about this a little bit, was, we asked you to upload or share with us your SOC 2 or ISO, right? And then we started seeing this pattern, and I don't want to pick on just small companies here. That was just an example, but we saw patterns of companies just literally, going in and clicking away at like, what is the best possible response to this question they're asking me, right? And under those scenarios, that's where we started kind of asking ourselves, okay, what is the validity? It became a trust but verify exercise. Um, on the other end too, Mark, we worked with a lot of companies that actually did read those questions and provided very accurate responses. And just because you told us you don't have something in place today, right, doesn't mean we automatically disqualify you. Right. This is a process. We have stakeholders. We evaluate responses. Obviously, there are risks that we can and cannot accept. But I think another part of this was like I actually did appreciate the transparency that some companies provided to this process we did. So, again, to kind of capture the response, there is absolutely, and I will stand behind this comment. There is no correlation to more questions, meaning you better assess a vendor, right? But really, again, our process was, we tried to really ask you, I wouldn't say unorthodox questions, but really ask you questions around more maturity versus do you have this in place or not?
And I think that's probably a better way to go about it too. Because at the end of the day, whether or not you ask like binary yes no questions, do you have this in place, or you go the maturity route, it's all just kind of a trust exercise. It's all going to be a self assessment. So giving them the opportunity to state, well, where exactly on the spectrum are you, as opposed to is something in place, is I can see that being more valuable. Even thinking of like consulting, if we're doing any kind of like NIST RMF type stuff, like rating the maturity of different like companies, you never touched five and you never really touched one. It was always somewhere kind of in between there. You had like a four to a two. So I think having those responses and the saying you see a five, like that's an outlier that needs to be looked at and kind of corroborated based on additional evidence.
Right. Um, I think you bring up a really really good point, and it was a core tenet of really what I still strongly believe in, and how we reflected our program is, as the questionnaires we built and the questionnaires we receive as supporting our go to market or sales function. At the end of the day, it's a self assessment, right? It's you asking me what I think or what we think is the maturity of our program or the state of our program, right? And one of our core tenets was any level of third party assurance. And this is not a conversation about who we think is the best auditor, right? Or what is the best tool to get you a SOC 2 or an ISO or whatever, was going to be was going to provide us more assurance, right? Than you telling us what you thought of yourself. So, as part of our assessment, right, we do ask, hey, do you have a SOC 1 type 1, type 2, da da da, ISO 20, 27001, 1718, da da da. And to the extent we could rely on those, it really allowed us to, I guess, be a little bit more scope specific in terms of the questions that we would ask you. So again, we had a catalog or small catalog, I should say, of questionnaire types, right? And based off of what you could provide us up front, we could also tailor the questions a little bit. But yeah, to that effect, Mark, there's just there's always a grain of salt when you're asking for a self assessment, which is why we built the program around. Come on, hopefully you showed your policies to somebody, right?
Now, when it comes to using different compliance frameworks or compliance reports as the additional sales collateral to make you make that decision. Now, once you got those, did you read the SOC 2 Type 2 reports? Because I feel like that's one of those things where we come into frequently where it's, hey, we need X, Y, and Z, and you send it to them, and they ask you follow up questions. It's like, yeah, that was like on page number 3 of the report. Did you read that report that you asked for?
You know what's interesting is we did, and there are different, certainly different sections of the SOC 2 that are very very valuable. Different sections to understand insight to the company, but when you get into, I believe, section 4, right, of the SOC 2, something that we just did scan. Again, we don't want to be, we want to, abide by, our core tenet, our core principle is like we will rely on a third party report, right? Is really understanding the controls that you were testing, and a lot of times, like, what observations or any findings that were identified in the report. And I would say more times than not, Mark, right? They're just these reports are coming up perfect, right? Nothing to document it in section 5, nothing to clarify on. Everything's perfect, no findings, test of effectiveness, all good and dandy, right? And maybe that's a separate conversation for another day, but we did. And I think one interesting observation for us, as it relates to SOC 2 reports was, we use that as collateral, as you know, Mark, for our, for helping our sales functions, right? Sales enablement and customer trust. In the, I don't know, Mark, you keep me honest here, and I don't know, 1,000 times we've sent out a SOC report. I don't know how many questions we've gotten from
No,
the
we're
report.
normally answering questions that could be answered if they actually read the SOC 2, which is always kind of funny when I think like requesting that as collateral, it needs to be done. It's usually also in contract language. You need to have this type of compliance obligation. And then it's like when you're providing the collateral, the teams that are spending all this time with those different questionnaires and requesting all the different documentations, they're not actually reading it. So I just think that was just a kind of fun portion of the vendor risk management programs that I'm seeing where it's like, oh, you're so close. You just got to get to that finish line and actually read the report.
Right. And I think that there's a tangential observation here is, we also provide our customers executive summaries of other security tests, right? And things like pen test reports. And I can tell you, in my observation experience, we get way more questions back around a one-page report, right? On a pen test than we do our SOC 2 that has all trust service criteria included, which I always found which I guess still find quite interesting is like, what is this? Have we perfectly scoped and written a SOC 2 report so well that it just is so self-contained, even if we are using section 5 to address the finding, right? Versus this 1 page or 2 page summary of a pen test. And why are people coming back and asking us questions about a low finding on a pen test? But I don't know, that to me is interesting, where in my experience I do I have observed that different parts of the security collateral uh portfolio get different level of attention or analysis.
Now, do you have any cutoff in terms of the security documentation that's being requested? What is I guess either too sensitive to share with external parties or external parties it doesn't provide them much value if you actually do give it to them. Because I think one of the things like penetration testing, I understand that one when companies come to us and ask for like full vulnerability scans of internal and external assets, that's one of those ones where I was kind of scratching my head thinking, do you understand the context in which that's like, if we provide you this report, like let's say we just do. So one, are you going to handle it properly? Like this is really sensitive information. Do you guys have like the appropriate functions and technologies in place for us? We almost have to do a vendor risk assessment like on our own side. Is if we were procuring a tool to do vendor or not vendor risk, vulnerability management, like we'd assess, hey, how are you guys storing these vulnerabilities because they're incredibly sensitive. And then two, once you do have that information, how much time are you actually going to be able to spend to get to a better confidence point that we have reduced risk, or even just that your company will be able to understand what's actually in the report? And how much time will then you come back to us kind of asking us to um, maybe address false positives or anything like that? That seems like just one of those requests that I don't quite understand the end outcome for that. Is that something similar for you? And are there other pieces of collateral that you've seen asked for that you're not quite sure what the end result is going to be?
Yeah, so I agree with your sentiment. I think it's one of those scenarios where it's like, do as I say, not as I do. Because I think if we flip the question and say, hey, show us the list of, whatever vulnerability tool that you pick, right? We're assuming you're running on some interval, some cadence. You know, if we flip the tables and we're looking to, you know, purchase and use your service, are you willing to share us, your last scan, right? Or whatever it may be. And I think the answer would be different, right? Because you're probably talking to different stakeholders at a company. But yeah, I'm not sure what the gist of some of those very very specific questions are, because in the example of vulnerability management, it's like point in time, right? And I think it's interesting where, you see some uptick outside of the normal sales cycle when there is a log4j, when there is a solar wind, right? Kind of this, very, very headline grabbing vulnerability out in the wild, where all of a sudden you see this trickle down of, oh, we need to see your vulnerability scans, right? And, again, what are you going to do with it? Right? A, we're not going to share it. B, what are you going to do with it? How do you understand the context of us running a particular library, right, within our application or infrastructure, right? There's almost very, very little context, right? I think what also is, I think, a little confusing to me too is, we do come across customers who, either ask for some type of, scanning, they'll run a network scan against us, or, they will, we've had this scenario too, Mark, and you're aware of this, where folks will run scans and, send things over and expect us to just triage it. And what I explain to these folks is there's a fine line, right, between, doing your security due diligence, running a network scanning tool, and what we would consider an attack, right? I mean, it's a very fine line, and to the extent of when we have looked at these, I think I would question, like, what do you're scanning things like SSL, right? DNS, you're scanning things like DMARC, even though we aren't a email tool, there's no platform for us to send messages, and like, what do you like? What context are you scanning us for, right? And I think it just goes back to this conversation, or how this conversation started was, when these teams do these things, I understand people are doing their job, right? They're trying to, understand the risk of, using a product to their company. But, a lot of times it's pretty clear and obvious there's no intent, there's no clear outcome in terms of folks doing this, right? And I think that's really where it's challenging. And that's not to say these scans have no value, right? It's to say these scans are, asking for things that, a company would actually probably be adhering to poor security practices, aka sharing your vulnerabilities externally, right? In doing, like, what does that tell you about a company, right? In some ways, going back to this example, I'd be terrified if a company would be, willing to share their vulnerabilities with us, right? I was like, hey, I mean, and now I know exactly where to, send an exploit, right? Or really understand kind of where the weak points within your system, or your security programs are, right? So, in some ways, it's a very interesting question, and obviously, being in the space of, we do want to provide customers transparency. That's really where, we are trying to do things, like the multiple pen tests a year, right? And being able to be very descriptive, right, Mark, in terms of, or more descriptive in like our SOC 2, right? As processes and technologies change, right? Of like, oh, we do a scan once a week, right? Trying to build upon that, and really work with our partners in both security engineering and engineering to make sure that, hey, as we build and as technology changes, that's reflected in, any sales collateral that we're willing to provide a customer.
And on the topic of transparency, Segment does have a bug bounty program. So if you do have something that you think might be a legitimate vulnerability, you are free to test it. You can just sign up for an account and go to town. But when it comes to security sales collateral, I've never received a request for a full internal or external vulnerability scan, just the full outputs, or somebody providing us some type of report produced by a company that runs an external scan on every single one of your domains that might not be related to the app itself, and ever had that feel like it created a measurable risk reduction for the customer who's requesting it, or that it was worth the time of all the teams who are engaged in determining whether or not things are valid or false
Yeah,
positives.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think the pen test is an interesting one too, because we have customers who ask, "Hey, can we run a pen test?" And we obviously have guardrails, but then my first question is, we use 2 3 different security researchers every year, right? What about their tests? Don't what about their tests or test methodology? Are you not getting assurances or the comfort level that you insist on doing your own pen tests, right? And that becomes then a conversation, in my experience, of, oh, we have our own testing methodology, and so I'm like, that's great, but you still need to apply that specifically to our product, right? So there is a ramp up, lead up time to be able to do that. And just going back to your bug bounty comment, I think I kind of rudely interrupted you there. I mean, if you are very confident in finding vulnerabilities, absolutely sign up for bug bounty, because A, you're going to get paid for
Yeah, I
it.
say we'll pay for it.
We'll pay you for it, and two, right? I mean, we have rules of engagement. Follow the rules of engagement. We have processes to address those, and you know, in the case of Segment, we have very trusted researchers we work with over the years, right? And they know our products very, very well, and they've been very good partners in the sense of identifying these bugs for us. So again, like, we have pushed customers to that too, right? They're like, "Oh, but we want to be able to find vulnerabilities within, your web application." It's like, well, funny you ask. We have a public bug bounty program, and I'm pretty sure it does not exclude existing customers or prospective customers. Just follow the bug bounty
I mean,
program
I
and
was
the
curious.
rules.
I signed up for my own bug bounty account, and I was like, "Oh, should I start doing this on my own company?" So yeah, anybody can sign up for it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's if you can find stuff, more power to you. I am. I mean, I know this is not the topic of the day, but I truly believe bug bounty is one of the highest ROIs you can have within a security program.
Yeah, in terms of I think how people would be interacting with your application, and you either have people who really know the application or people who don't, and I think there's value to each one of those. Where it's like if you don't know what menu options to click, how our application runs, what exactly it's supposed to do, like you can glean some interesting insights from that versus somebody who has that expert knowledge of here's exactly how Segment is providing benefit to these businesses.
Yeah, I mean, it's relatively. I mean, compared to like automated tooling, yes, it is much higher signal, right? The signal to noise ratio is much higher. Obviously, we still get false positives and things like duplicates, but to that extent, yeah. I mean, think about the you know bounties that you're paying. It's like, yeah, a really, really strong ROI. That's again a separate conversation for probably another guest.
So the bug bounty and penetration testing covers the technical complexity. How about legal complexity? Talking about redlining contracts, DPAs, security addendums, and appendices. Where have you seen some issues or some of the pain points within that process?
Yeah, I will tier this back to you, Mark, because I think you have some insight to this that actually I probably don't, in terms of run books that you've created with our legal team. So I think I would, in some ways, I will ask you questions on your own podcast. But I think in terms of, I think the stray here, I'll state the obvious for a second here, right? Is you have different teams, you have different, I'll call it classifications of customers. You have folks who are just single use pay with credit card, right? And they can sign up and get the MSA, but sometimes they'll push back and be like, "Hey, we need to negotiate." And then you have your enterprise customers that have legal teams that are larger than our security teams, right? That'll say, "Hey, nope, we got to negotiate everything." I think that challenges challenges that I have seen actually is a kind of a backwards looking problem. And I think this is true with a lot of the folks that I have spoken with, Mark, is just really understanding kind of the totality, right? The aggregate of like what have we agreed to, right? Yeah, I'll pick on one that comes up a lot. Breach notification, right? How many customers do we need to notify in 72 hours? Or maybe it's 48, or maybe it's a week, right? What do we need to notify them on, right? What's this process? Who do, so on and so forth. As you know, MSAs, DPAs can get very, very detailed, right? And over the years, folks negotiate different things. And I think one of the challenges is folks on security teams leave and change roles, which is fine, right? But then, you bring in a different perspective. And again, that's where the run books come in, pretty helpful. And I'll ask you about that. But then the other aspects of it too is there are deals that security may not see at all, right? So then the question I have for, I guess the GRC practitioner is like, how are you getting comfort, right? That, there are strong enough processes that you're getting plugged into when, an exhibit, right? That is specific to security gets changed, right? And that could be, I think for, the more, leaning left organizations, maybe there are tooling that will allow you to flag DPAs, MSAs that are non-standard. But really, for most organizations, that comes back to process, right? How do you know that security has signed off? How do you know that security has reviewed this, right? And I think the conversation, the longer you wait to have that conversation, in some ways you've aggregated, we'll call it like security legal debt, right? Of trying to understand and unwind like all these things that you may have agreed to, right? And you aren't even aware of it, regardless of whether you comply or not, right? It's just being able to surface, what are the things that I need to be focusing on? Because we talk about from a risk and from a compliance, right? And I think that third pillar of like what Dustin said is understanding the business is extremely important. But, the pen to paper aspect of this is like, well, what have you agreed to? Right. And how do you know that you need to execute on it? And then even on that other side of it, Mark, is like, even if you know you've agreed to something, right? How's that surfacing to the rest of the security team? Right? How do they know that they need to be able to do, you know, I'll make this up, 4 pen tests a year, right? Or they need to be able to rotate images on a weekly basis, right?
Well, I was gonna say,
Whatever it may be.
what's it called breach notification was the one that I think you and I worked on specifically, and it was just kind of the realization I can't make the decision for like our cert lead. I can't go into contracts and say, oh yes, we will absolutely do like 24 hours or something that's more accelerated versus what our standard like 72 hours in the DPA is, without consulting the person who's going to ultimately be accountable for making sure that's happening. So just being that kind of good teammate and making sure your team is aware, and if there is that language in there, like it's not that we can't negotiate it, but you also have to be able to pull the right people in.
Yeah. Absolutely. You're spot on. It's like it's a process. I mean, if GRC or the person reviewing the agreement owns it, then yeah, that's a slightly easier conversation. But 9 times out of 10, they don't. Right? There are control owners or functional owners that they need to engage with. Um, so to that extent, Mark, I'm going to ask you kind of the question that you teed up is like, how do you view or what processes have you viewed as valuable where for example Mark goes on a 1 month vacation, right, and somebody else needs to step in and negotiate this enterprise deal for the largest deal in company history, right? Like what structure have you provided where somebody can come in and have some sort of guardrail, right, in terms of saying this is something I can, there is leeway or there's not leeway to.
Hey, I was gonna say 1 month, try 3. So I was recently on paternity leave, and I had that where I had to transition over some of the customer trust stuff to other internal teams. When it comes to language, this is something that I worked on for months after I started working with you and Dustin. Was one kind of figuring out the appropriate way to strike things that were requested from customers. There are certain aspects where you want to do scalpel as opposed to just a broad wipe of certain full sections of a DPA or any kind of legal agreement. So it was one, kind of getting the understanding of how the business operates, and then two, once you get that understanding, there's no real way to document that, as opposed to just you have to keep doing it and kind of understand the other stakeholders and how they're operating. But once you do have that, then you can kind of key in on some key clauses that you might not want to agree upon, or once you see them, really need to be red flags. Like audit rights, that's one of those ones where we're currently seeing that at Twilio, where staffing that we currently have versus the amount of audits that are coming in, there's definitely a volume versus resources component that needs to be considered. And when you are allowing additional elevated levels of audit that might involve some type of on-site, but you're not documenting that, you might be setting yourself up in the future to kind of feel that pain. Other things, yeah, working with team members, having like breach notification or any other types of vulnerability things that like ProdSec or vulnerability management teams or CERT might not be aware of, that you might have taken the authority to negotiate on their behalf, but didn't communicate the end results. And even things like CISO, like we want to bring the CISO into specific issues. Like that's not one of those ones where me as a GRC resource reading this can say, hey, yes, if something happens, if it's especially if it's suspected and not confirmed, then our CISO will contact you, and I don't manage their time. So just keying in on those different potential clauses and saying, hey, this is a go, this is a no go, or this is not something that we can't negotiate. But if we're going to negotiate it, here are the different considerations that you need to think about.
Yeah, so let me ask you just one more follow up question on that, Mark. I think folks may be familiar with this concept of shifting left, right? Where we're pushing, identifying things like vulnerabilities earlier with engineers through the CI/CD pipeline. How does that concept apply within contract management or contract negotiations in the context of to what extent have you been able to lean on the legal team to be able to do that, right? Where, they can really start addressing or negotiating or redlining things on security's behalf, right? Before they ever have to reach out to you or myself or anybody else on security. So any takes on that?
No, I think that's good because in terms of shifting left, this is one of those that the actual act itself of doing the contract negotiation is not really something you can shift to the beginning of the sales process if you don't kind of know the criteria of what you're going to be signing into. But yeah, definitely self-serve type information for legal, so they're aware of, hey, here's like standard operating procedures. Like I can put that document in front of them and they can execute it just as well as I can, and probably more if they have other additional considerations that they're thinking about based on their own kind of knowledge of contract law and the additional risks that might arise from the way that certain things are phrased or the way that certain clauses are presented in the contract. So, yeah, it's mostly the self-serve aspect, which I think we've also done with the sales process too. And whenever we get those questionnaire requests in from different people who might want to be using our product, we do have the self-serve, hey, here's the answers to all the common security questions that we're having. So yeah, anytime we can, making sure that the teams who are going to be accountable for that particular task, or they have the most to lose, like the sales team, like I don't want to be standing in the way of them being able to close the sale, one, for the ARR to the company, and two, like if that's their commission, like I don't want them waiting on me to be like, oh no, now I have to wait like an additional 2 weeks to see this on my paycheck. So making sure that they are empowered to have the information they need to make the decisions to move the deals forward.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really good point. And I think the context from legal is important because I think one example is oftentimes we'll get pulled in and say, hey, you need to review this MSA or you need to review this DPA, but we don't look we don't have access or we don't have view to kind of the totality of it, right? And a lot of times we'll have to lean on our legal friends and be like, oh, okay, so this actually contradicts the MSA and the DPA contradict one another. I was like, okay, well, we'll need your help to actually untangle that. But I think all very valuable and good points, Mark.
Like trying to centralize it to those teams that have the most knowledge is always beneficial. Now, one thing I did want to ask you in terms of the shifting left mentality, and I don't know if this is based on the history of the importance of security and kind of how it's become more important to everybody in more recent years, but anytime I'm dealing with a vendor where we'll have sales reach out and they'll go, this deal needs to get signed on Friday and it's a Thursday, and they give us some like 300-page questionnaire. I always kind of ask myself, like, what is the security team over there expecting? Because security at this point in time and like in 2023 should be a go no go decision. If there are things in there that we answer that are potentially problematic, like you're risking, depending on how many like weeks, months, maybe even close to a year of time that's gone into this contract, asking those security questions at that point in time, I feel like sets the other business up for failure and kind of doesn't create that obviously good working relationship with security for the business stakeholders. Because especially if I'm like, yeah, if they do find something that like is no go criteria for them, what are they going to tell their stakeholders? Like, whoops a daisy, sorry, we decided to do this one day before you were signing, and now you have to find a new tool. From your perspective, what's the importance of shifting left and security becoming more important in the sales process?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and you know, I'll answer the kind of the very last question first, which is, you know, where's security's role in kind of contract negotiations? I'm not in go to market, right? So my view is again really more from when security gets engaged. There have been at least a handful of deals that I've been pulled into where I genuinely believe that security was the last thing that needs to be negotiated. So you're talking about things like credits and warranties and, you know, support models and, you know, consumption models, right? And there were a couple deals where, you know, we were pulled in and said, hey, these are the two things that, you know, we need to get aligned with today, or this is not happening. And you know, it could be breach, it could be audit rights, it could be kind of a variety of things. So I do think, Mark, to answer your question, you know, security I would not say is ever like the lone kind of lever or lone pillar that needs to be evaluated and is the last thing, is the most important thing to close a deal, right? Each both directions. But you know, I've seen it, and I genuinely believe that it was a thing that we had to figure out. I think to answer your question around, you know, what is this, you know, what happens when we're all in this predicament, right? This thing needs to be signed, and like the security teams are meeting, you know, for the first time, you know, 24 hours prior. And I think there's, you know, I think there's a guardrail that you know, we should all be asking. We meaning the folks who are on the side of responding to the questionnaire is like, have you engaged your security team? Right. And in some cases, it's going to be more than a security team. If you're talking about some of these large enterprise customers, right, the team that is doing the assessment is not the same team that has to validate remediation, which is not the same team that has to log the risk. You may or may not be familiar with the example I'm talking about there, Mark.
Yep.
But I think to that extent, yeah, I don't know what the solution is outside of, you know, when we're having these conversations, go to market, or go to market as having these conversations. I think there's a fundamental expectation that, yeah, you know, this customer, this prospective customer is going to ask about security, right? You know, have you asked that? Because if you haven't, and you just assume that for whatever reason in 2023 they don't care about security questions, and we get pulled in 24 hours before, it's likely not going to be a good conversation. Not that because we don't have a security program, it's just because you have two teams scrambling to get something done, and it's going to be very, very chaotic. I've seen this happen before. I've seen this happen in a way where, you know, the you know, and no fault of the team that has to do that due diligence, they're trying to get a lot of context. And to your point, Mark, some of these deals are a year in the making or more, right? And they have never heard of the tool or this SaaS product that we provide, right? And you're trying to explain, right, what a, you know, a privacy portal is, right, or what a destination is, right? And they're, you know, you know, there's, you know, they're not going to get it within, you know, an hour, right, to understand, oh, what type of data are we sending over, what are they doing with it, what do you mean we only opt in, and in terms of sending what we want. So yeah, I don't know what the clear cut solution is to that is, but to me, that's a process breakdown, right? Is like, you know, somebody who's so eager to get this deal done, I get it, but you got to ask the questions like, are all the stakeholders there? Because, you know, for us, unfortunately, security can be in the cheap seats, and what I mean by that is like we're just not involved in a deal at all until the very last second, and then it becomes a very, very clunky and a lot of times awkward conversation.
I think the things that I'm talking about, yes, I'm frustrated about it, but at the same time, I like to have positive relationships with my customers. I don't like to talk to a security team and they're grumpy at me, I'm grumpy at them. Like that's not good for anybody. Calling some of these issues out, I just want to hopefully trigger some teams to think about, hey, is this really the best way to go about this, or even just acknowledgement of like, oh, am I doing this? I've just been doing this work for so long that I didn't even consider that this was happening, and hopefully taking the solutions and figuring out how to again moving this left in the process so you're not kind of being hung out to dry there at the very end.
Yeah, no, I agree with your point though. Moving kind of the negotiation, the security due diligence left in some ways is a much more challenging task then moving kind of what we consider the other aspects of security left, right? Because there is a certain point before, a lot of our prospective customers will invest in the security due diligence, regardless of what we think the due diligence is, right? It could be great, could be not so great. But yeah, I think that's the challenging part. But I do think, to some of the work that you've done, and credit to you in terms of creating some run books and creating a little bit more granularity in terms of our process has definitely helped us in terms of not having to get to these clunky last second conversations, which again is not always avoidable.
And actually, from the BISO perspective, you might not be, I guess, as aligned with the tactics of these particular functions as they are now. But when it comes to like what version two of vendor risk and security sales enablement are, I think we've reached a point at Twilio Net segment where the things that we're doing, they're functioning pretty well. What does the next version look like to you? Where do you think the key points for betterments are?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think there's, I'll separate the two different areas a little bit, the kind of the sales enablement piece and the third party piece, Mark. I am a big believer again, of creating transparency for our customers, right? And going back to the example of, oh, we're perfect at security, right? We spend so much money on bug bounty or third party testing or whatnot. Like that to me is not, that is not really what the customers are looking for, right? The customers, I would say 9 times out of 10 when I'm talking to somebody on the other side, I do think, to a point that you made earlier, is like, you want to know the security, teams on the other side. Security is a relationship based business, right? In many ways, the way I think about it is they're not, they're purchasing a SaaS product, right? And they're not purchasing controls from a security standpoint or processes. They're really purchasing, or they're betting on, hey, this security practitioner or this team on the other side, right? I have some level of assurance that, hey, if something were to happen, right, they can react, or they're getting in front of threats and vulnerabilities that are emerging that may impact, how I use this product or how this product secures my data. So, you've heard me say this before. I really do think security is a relationship based business, right? Regardless of what role you are, there is a relationship that we are trying to establish. And obviously, relationships are grounded in trust. And a part of that is us being transparent. And again, that doesn't mean we share every vulnerability that comes across our scans and analysis, but we talk about things like, hey, if this scenario were to come up, this is what we would do, and this is how you would be notified, or this is what we'd be willing to share with you. But as it relates to kind of how I see 2.0 going, I, I really hope there is this evolution of what we have now, and I'll use the word standardization, Mark, in terms of how we are going to go about either assessing a vendor, or how we are going to provide documentation, collateral on how we comply to that standard, right? I think right now, and maybe folks listening to this can kind of hear, kind of, or listen between the lines, is there's not a lot of standardization, right? There's a lot of, you know do what we think where it makes the most sense, and sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. So it feels like, what we are doing is very, very much haphazard, I'll call it, as an industry, right? And I would love a little bit more standardization. Standardization is going to come with, when we, realize, or, realize capabilities of some of the technological changes over the next couple of years as well. I would say, it's increasing transparency on the customer trust, and I would say self enablement side. I think that's important for every company. Is like, whether you think it's a customer trust portal or more standardized audits, and really creating workflow and automation in that process, more power to you. A lot of vendors in that space today. But I think, really where I see, the GRC practitioner in that space doing is, again, thinking about it from a way of like, what do I not have to do today? Because really, you should be focusing more on like, how do I up level the program as a whole, even if you're a very junior member, or how do I spend more time with a specific customer or a specific deal, right? What's prohibiting me from doing that? right? I think that's really where, the whole concept of like where tooling automation and standardization comes in. And then on the vendor assessment side, really, I think the question I would ask, the third party risk functions or the vendor risk functions or folks responsible for supply chain is like, how do you measure, the value of your program, right? Is it by the number of assessments that you do, right? Is it by the number of risks that you log, right? Right. I think your mileage may vary depending on like what is, where you are in that function and where that function sits within an organization. But I think ultimately going back to what Dustin had mentioned is like, even as a risk assessing organization, right, you need to be able to go back and say, like, how are you enabling the business? And enabling the business may, mean, hey, you've managed risk down to an acceptable level, right? You've actually turned down vendors that the business actually, or third parties, I should say, that the business really wanted to use, right? So it's really again going back to, how do I become more efficient with my program, right? How do I show that it's, you know, the word risk comes in, right? Vendor, third party. Like, how am I showing that I am, managing this for the company? And then I think the other aspects of it too is really thinking about it from a perspective of like, what is my program responsible for? Right? Where does it fit? Because in the example of, I think, third parties, we typically default to things like, hey, we're going to do an annual assessment on our cloud service providers, right? And we a lot of times can't even assess them, they're so massive, and we're a small fish in big pond. We'll get their third party report and be done. But then I think as programs mature, right, I would start challenging some of these leaders in these programs to think about like, hey, where do things like third party libraries come into play, right? Like, how are my developers pulling this? It is somebody is writing code for us and we're interjecting it somewhere within our, infrastructure or application stack, right? Has that been assessed? Right? Like, how do you know like that vendor is, using the latest library within their own packages, right? So I think there's a litany of questions that I think the third party risk functions should be asking themselves. It's like, okay, again, the business alignment, what am I assessing? What am I reporting? Right. And really what I'm trying to say here, Mark, is like really getting away of this concept of I'll call it a volume based metric, right? The number of questions I ask, the number of findings I document, or the number of assessments that I do. And because that a lot of times doesn't give your stakeholders enough context, is really like, what am I like really driving down to like, what am I, where, or what am I doing to help the business move forward?
For this podcast, I'm like, oh, in every single one of these episodes, I'm going to ask like, what are some quick wins that people can accomplish if they, as they go back to work Monday? And I almost think based on conversation I had with Dustin, and then some of those things that you listed, the questions to ask yourself are probably going to be better than you giving some type of prescriptive. Here's the thing that you need to do to launch your program in a new direction. So I'm definitely going to be re-listening to this and thinking about some of those as I go forward next week.
Yeah, and maybe I can provide a little context because it was a little rambly on the last one, but I think this applies across the board, and I'll just pick on GRC here. But I really would encourage everybody to look at their program as a product. And what I mean by that is, at the end of the day, you have customers, right? Whether again they're internal or external, right? And you are providing them a service, and the service could be you're doing, DAS or SAS, some type of, code analysis, right? You could be providing them, we'll call it like a BISO service, where you're liaising regularly between the business and a security team. Or in the examples we've been talking about, Mark, you could be assessing, third parties, vendors, again, whatever we want to call them, or within you, or whatever teams want to call them within the organization. You're providing a product, right? And other times, a product can be a service. It goes back to the conversation that you and I have had, is like thinking about the work that we do as a service, and really thinking about asking yourself very, very honest questions. Is like, why would somebody use this product that I am providing? Are they using it because they have to? Right? Are they using it because it provides them some type of value? Again, value is a very broad bucket, right? But I think it goes to a level of self reflection. Is like, If they're using this because they have to, right? What have you done, right, to make this process, or I should say this product, a good product, right? Have you taken stakeholder feedback? Do you have information on why this is a valuable product? And I do want to draw to an example that, at least for me, was quite eye opening, Mark, which was a couple of years ago on the segment side, just because of the questions we were getting, right, from very large customers of, what we had considered above and beyond standard security requirements. Very short reach notification, analysis on their workspace, customer audit rights, right? Kind of we'll call it the above and beyond. We went down this road of creating a product called enhanced security, and going down this path of working with product management and saying, okay, help us understand, define the product, define the customer, define what you think this revenue stream may be. Obviously that's not going to be applicable for an internal service, but it was eye opening in the sense of it really asked the question of, why would anybody use this product that I am responsible for, right? And I think that really is something I would recommend folks asking, because then you can ask yourself, and again, this is a lot of times an introspective conversation, is like, are people using this because they just have to? Like, am I just a gatekeeper? It goes and asks questions around like UI or UX. Like, have I designed my process, right, or product potentially internally in a way that's usable, right? Do I have a form for intake of feedback? And there's a very specific example I have on that too. Is there's this concept of NPS, right? I think our go-to-market partners will be very familiar with that. Is Net Promoter Score. It's really, how likely are you to recommend a product or service to somebody else? And we did that last year for the BISO program. We did it once. I would encourage us to do it again, but we got direct feedback, and a lot of times it was, oh, you guys are directly aligned, and there was other feedback that you weren't. And I would kind of, ask that question of folks who are creating these products, is like, would you send an NPS out, right? Assuming you know who your stakeholders are, what would they say about your product today, right? Again, are they using it because you're another check mark that they need, right? Do they understand the value that you're providing, right? So again, if there was one piece of feedback that I would just constantly encourage teams to think about, it's, again, how am I evaluating my product, its relevancy, and its value?
Yeah, if there's one main takeaway that you've shared with me, it's productizing all the work that you're doing. You can't just be creating work just because it's your role to get something done. It needs to be done in the service of the business and the people who are going to be using it.
Yeah, it goes back to that whole comment I said around security is about relationships. And part of the relationship is, how have you, again, the product you provide, how are you, helping them? How are you enabling them? Maybe just one last example, just because I think it's important that folks understand this is not something that is revolutionary by any means. There are teams within engineering that do this all the time. They create internal tooling, and they will send out a developer questionnaire or developer NPS and say, "I built this tool for you, right? Are you using it?" Right? In the case of security, right, Mark, that's a great example. You built an Airtable, you built a policy, but you got 6 page reviews, right? You probably have a visibility and a usability or a usage issue that you need to work through, right? And again, this isn't about creating a lot of buzz or views for a particular page, but at the end of the day, you are likely creating something for somebody else to consume, and it's really about this reflection of, like, again, are people using it? Why or why not? And I think something where maybe one last example is, like, anytime you procure a tool, you see a lot of energy, right, rallying around, oh, let's get this tool live, GA, right? And you'll get stakeholders feedback right at the beginning, be like, oh, okay, how do where do you want this button placed, right? Or what additional guidance do you need? Then it goes live, and then you're just like, oh, okay, it's like already feels like it's end of life, right?
Yep.
It's in maintenance mode. So again, I think part of this is really defining, again, understanding the products that you own, and then really assessing, hey, what is the life cycle, what is the state of this product? And I almost guarantee you, if you reach out to stakeholders and just be like, give me candid feedback, I think folks will be very, very, you know, uh, forward with providing you that feedback.
No, that's this is why I love doing these conversations. Like NPS, I'm gonna do a little bit more googling on that one, and then knowing that internal engineering teams are already doing something like this, I always encourage GRC folks like you need to be a friend to all. So go meet the engineering team, go figure out what they're doing, go see what process they have in place to collect that feedback, and then see how you can apply that to the work that you're doing.
Absolutely.
All right, Steve, if anybody else wanted to get in contact with you, pick your brain about all things GRC or BSO, embedded security, anything else that might be under your domain, how can they get in contact with you?
The best way would actually just be through LinkedIn. I do check my messages on LinkedIn. I do have to filter by some of the sales folks. They can get a little noisy, but you send me a message on LinkedIn. I will be happy to connect with you on this topic, or if there's another one that you want to chat about, I will be happy to do it. Just mention you're a friend of Mark.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to add all of that to the show notes on the grcpodcast.com. Steve, thank you again for talking with me. You're not getting out of the one on one we have on Friday. So I'll be talking to you again then.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark.